Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Nevada. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the winter of 1880, when Nevada's silver boom was already beginning to fade, travelers crossing the barren expanses between Virginia City and Austin would often seek refuge at isolated stopping points along the rutted wagon trails. The desert nights were unforgiving, with temperatures plummeting below freezing. Most who traveled these routes knew the established stops by name and reputation. Juniper Creek Boardinghouse stood approximately 28 miles east of Virginia City, nestled in a small depression where an underground spring provided precious water in the otherwise arid landscape. The two-story wooden structure, with its weathered clapboard siding, had been built during the height of the Comstock lode discoveries, initially serving as a way station for ore wagons and prospectors. By 1880, it had become primarily a boarding house run by a widow, known to locals simply as Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. According to county records from Story County, Eleanor Blackwood was not the original owner. The property had first belonged to a George Blackwood, who received the deed in 1863. His name appears on tax rolls until 1876, when ownership transferred to his wife. What's curious about this transfer is that no death certificate for George Blackwood was ever filed in Story County, nor in neighboring counties. The absence of this document would become significant only years later. A thorough search of regional newspapers from that period revealed no obituary for George Blackwood, which was unusual for property owners of even modest means. There was, however, a brief mention in the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise dated October 3, 1876, noting that G. Blackwood's absence from recent mining association meetings has been explained by Mrs. Blackwood as due to his departure east on family business. No subsequent reports of his return were ever published. The Juniper Creek boarding house stood at a strategic location along what was then called the Central Nevada Road, approximately 7 miles from the nearest mining camp and 12 miles from the closest ranch. The property consisted of the main two-story structure, a stable large enough for 6 horses, a storage shed, and a small smokehouse set slightly apart from the other buildings. A hand-dug well tapped into the underground spring, providing year-round water, a rarity in that part of Nevada, and the primary reason the location had been developed. According to the original county surveyor's report from 1863, the property encompassed roughly 20 acres, though most of it remained in its natural desert state. The boarding house itself was constructed of locally harvested pine, with a stone foundation. The main floor contained a common dining room, kitchen, and parlor, while the second floor was divided into 6 guest rooms of varying sizes. A 7th room, larger than the others and positioned at the end of the hallway, served as Mrs. Blackwood's private quarters. The Juniper Creek boarding house developed a peculiar reputation among regular travelers of the route. Stagecoach drivers reported that male passengers traveling alone would occasionally request to be let off there, particularly those heading eastward toward the interior. Ms. Blackwood charged reasonable rates, cheaper than accommodations in Virginia City, and was known to serve hearty meals. Yet local ranch hands and miners from nearby claims rarely stayed there, preferring to make the longer journey to larger settlements. When questioned about this preference years later, an elderly former silver miner named Thomas Wilkes told a reporter from the Territorial Enterprise, "There was something about the place that didn't sit right." Mrs. Blackwood was handsome enough for a woman her age, always dressed proper, spoke real refined, but her eyes never seemed to match her smile, if that makes any sense, like they were calculating something, while her mouth was saying something else entirely. Eleanor Blackwood was described in multiple accounts as a woman of medium height and slender build, appearing to be in her early 40s during the late 1870s. She typically wore her dark hair streaked with premature gray, pulled back severely from a face that observers called handsome rather than pretty. Several travelers noted her unusually precise manner of speaking, suggesting education beyond what was common for frontier women. She claimed to have come originally from Philadelphia, though no records confirming this background were ever discovered. Of particular note was Mrs. Blackwood's custom of personally greeting each guest upon arrival, often standing on the front porch, regardless of weather or hour. According to the recollections of Elijah Merriman, a freight driver who regularly passed by the boarding house, she'd be there, like she was expecting you, even when there was no way to know who was coming down that road or when. Standing straight-backed in that black dress she favored, hands folded just so. First couple times it happened, I nearly drove my team off the road, her appearing like that. The first documented disappearance connected to the boarding house occurred in April of 1877. A businessman from San Francisco named Robert Cartwright was reported missing by his company when he failed to arrive in Austin for a scheduled meeting regarding mining investments. Company records showed he had departed Virginia City by stagecoach on April 18th. The stage driver confirmed dropping Cartwright at Juniper Creek Boarding House, where the businessman had decided to stay overnight before continuing his journey. When questioned, Mrs. Blackwood acknowledged Mr. Cartwright had indeed stayed one night but had left early the following morning with a private freight wagon that happened to be heading east. She produced a register with his signature and date of stay. The investigation went no further, as such travel arrangements were common in the territory, and missing persons cases rarely received thorough attention unless foul play was obvious. Cartwright's case might have remained just another frontier disappearance had it not been for a letter discovered years later among his company's archived correspondence. Dated April 17, 1877, the day before he departed Virginia City, Cartwright wrote to his business partner, "Have secured passage to Austin and expect to arrive no later than the 20th. The Comstock Bank matter is nearly settled, and I carry with me drafts totaling $8,400 for the Austin investment. Will telegraph upon arrival." The substantial sum he carried was never recovered or accounted for. Between 1877 and 1880, at least 7 more male travelers were reported missing after being last seen at or near Juniper Creek. In each case, Mrs. Blackwood provided plausible explanations, often corroborated by her register book showing they had stayed and departed. Given the transient nature of Nevada's population during the silver boom, authorities found no reason to connect these disappearances or investigate them deeply. Among these vanished travelers was Heinrich Miller, a German metallurgist traveling to inspect new smelting equipment in Austin. Jonathan Farnsworth, a cattle buyer from Sacramento, carrying significant funds. William Delaney, a lawyer representing Eastern investors, and 4 others identified only by last names in subsequent investigations: Peterson, Ainsworth, Campbell, and Richardson. What united these men, as later analysis would reveal, was that they were all traveling alone. All carried substantial sums of money or valuable items, and none had close connections in the immediate area who would quickly raise an alarm at their disappearance. The isolation of Juniper Creek Boarding House proved ideal for Mrs. Blackwood's purposes. In winter months, heavy snowfall in the higher elevations could close alternative routes, forcing travelers to stop at her establishment. During summer, the extreme heat made night travel preferable, again increasing the likelihood of guests arriving at dusk seeking accommodation. The nearest law enforcement was stationed in Virginia City, a half-day's ride away at best, and the sheriff's meager resources were primarily focused on maintaining order in the still rowdy mining communities. Despite its remote location, the boarding house was surprisingly well appointed by frontier standards. Several guests who stayed there and lived to tell about it described the interior as unexpectedly refined, with touches of genuine elegance. Mrs. Blackwood maintained a small library of bound books, unusual in such a setting, and her dining table was set with quality silverware and porcelain that seemed out of place so far from civilization. Later investigation would reveal that many of these items had belonged to her missing guests. What distinguishes the Blackwood case from many other frontier mysteries is the discovery made in June of 1881, when a surveying party for the proposed Carson and Colorado Railroad was assessing routes through the area. The party's lead engineer, William Hayes, had decided to take measurements in the ravine behind the Boardinghouse property, approximately 400 yards from the main building. According to Hayes's journal, which was later donated to the Nevada Historical Society in Reno, what the survey team discovered was initially mistaken for a natural sinkhole, a depression about 20 feet in diameter where the ground appeared to have collapsed. Upon closer inspection, they realized the depression contained what Hayes described as a most troubling collection of personal effects. His journal entry for June 12, 1881, reads, "Russell noticed something gleaming in the depression as the sun hit it just so. Upon investigation, we discovered a gold pocket watch half buried in the soil. Further examination revealed other items, a gentleman's boot, several buttons that appeared to be from different garments, and, most disturbingly, what Johnson identified as human teeth scattered throughout the disturbed earth. The entire area gives off a most foul odor when disturbed, suggesting decomposition beneath." The surveying party documented finding several pocket watches, leather wallets, boots, and remnants of men's clothing partially buried in the loose soil. Hayes, concerned by the unusual discovery, sent one of his assistants to Virginia City to alert the sheriff. This began the first formal investigation of the Juniper Creek boarding house. Sheriff James McPherson arrived 3 days later with 2 deputies. By this time, Mrs. Blackwood had apparently been informed of the discovery. According to the official report filed on June 17, 1881, when the lawmen reached the boarding house, they found the building empty and cold, with no sign of recent occupation. More troublingly, the underground spring that had supplied the property with water had been deliberately contaminated with what appeared to be coal oil and various chemicals from the boarding house's storage shed. A manifest found in the kitchen listed supplies that had been delivered just 1 week prior, suggesting Mrs. Blackwood's departure had been sudden and unplanned. The guest register remained open on the front desk, with the most recent entry dated June 11th, the day before the surveying party made their discovery. This final guest was listed as J. Morris, San Francisco, with no subsequent record of this individual ever being found. The hasty nature of Eleanor Blackwood's flight was evidenced by personal items left behind, including several dresses in her wardrobe, a silver hairbrush on her dressing table, and a half-written letter found in her desk drawer. This letter, addressed simply to Margaret with no surname or address, contained only a few lines. "Business continues satisfactorily, though supplies grow more expensive. The new preparation method you suggested has indeed improved the final product, and my regular customers in VC have—" The letter broke off mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. A thorough search of the property revealed several disturbing features that had gone unnoticed by casual visitors. The cellar beneath the main house had been expanded well beyond what would be normal for storage purposes. A series of small rooms had been constructed using thick wooden beams and heavy doors with external bolts. In one corner, investigators discovered a collection of personal documents belonging to at least 12 different men, some matching the names of those reported missing over the previous years. The cellar rooms contained iron rings mounted to the walls at various heights, suggesting restraints had been used. The earthen floor showed evidence of repeated scrubbing, and in some areas had been covered with fresh soil. Most disturbing was a drainage channel carved into the floor, leading to a covered pit approximately 4 feet deep. When investigators removed the wooden cover, they discovered the pit contained layers of quicklime interspersed with what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments. Connected to the main cellar by a narrow tunnel was a secondary chamber that extended beneath the smokehouse. This room contained specialized equipment that initially puzzled investigators. Sheriff McPherson's report describes a large wooden table with grooves cut into its surface, draining into collection vessels below, and an assortment of knives, saws, and hooks that would be appropriate for a butcher's shop, though larger than standard. The walls were lined with shelves holding glass jars containing preserved substances that were not immediately identified. Most significant was a leather-bound ledger found beneath a loose floorboard in Mrs. Blackwood's private quarters. Unlike the public register shown to authorities during previous inquiries, this private account book detailed not just guests' names and dates of stay, but inventories of their possessions, estimates of their wealth based on appearance and conversation, and notes about their physical condition and temperament. Next to certain names were notations about usability and duration, the meaning of which would later become horrifyingly clear. For some entries, precise amounts were recorded, presumably money or valuables taken from the individuals. Several pages contained recipes and preparation instructions that initially appeared to be for traditional preserved meats and jerky, common in frontier households where fresh meat was seasonal. The final pages of the ledger contained a meticulous accounting system, tracking sales of special preserves and premium cured meats to customers identified only by initials. These transactions showed substantial profits, with deliveries apparently made monthly to Virginia City and occasionally to Carson City. The ledger indicated these premium products commanded prices up to 10 times higher than standard preserved meats, suggesting either extraordinary quality or some other factor justifying the expense. The investigation expanded to the ravine behind the property. After removing the loose topsoil, deputies discovered what Sheriff McPherson's report describes as a charnel pit of considerable depth and diameter containing the dismembered and partially preserved remains of no fewer than 9 adult human males. The preservation method used on some of the remains suggested knowledge of butchering and meat-curing techniques. More disturbing was evidence that portions of the bodies had been systematically removed before disposal. Fleming's complete findings, when finally made public 4 decades later, included the observation that the precision of the butchery indicates professional knowledge or extensive practice, and that certain organs appear to have been carefully extracted from each victim, suggesting a methodical approach beyond mere disposal of evidence. His report also noted that several of the victims showed signs of having been kept alive for days or weeks before death, based on evidence of healed injuries and restraint marks at wrists and ankles. Medical examiner Dr. Joseph Fleming's report, sealed until 1921, concluded that these removed portions were consistent with prime cuts of meat one would harvest from livestock. Doctor. The implications were clear, though so shocking that newspapers of the time reported only that human remains had been discovered, attributing the deaths to robbery and murder. The full details were deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The Virginia City Territorial Enterprise on June 24, 1881, reported only that a woman proprietor of a remote boarding house is sought in connection with several disappearances, and that foul play of the most serious nature is suspected. Further examination of the property revealed an elaborate system for selecting victims. The guest rooms themselves contained small peepholes allowing observation from the hallway, and the floor of one upstairs room had been modified to create a trapdoor mechanism leading directly to the cellar below. This suggested that Mrs. Blackwood carefully assessed her guests before determining which ones would simply pay and depart, and which would become victims of her gruesome enterprise. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Mrs. Blackwood did not always work alone. Several entries in her ledger referred to an assistant identified only as M, who apparently helped with processing and deliveries. This individual was never identified, though speculation centered on a Margaret Wilson who had briefly worked as a cook at a Virginia City hotel and who disappeared around the same time as Mrs. Blackwood. Eleanor Blackwood was never found. A statewide alert was issued, with her description circulated to law enforcement throughout Nevada and neighboring territories. Several reported sightings in Utah and later in Colorado, proved inconclusive. The most credible report came from a train conductor who believed he had seen her boarding an eastbound train in Elko, traveling under the name Mrs. Eleanor Woodson. The property at Juniper Creek was seized by Story County and eventually burned to the ground in what official records describe as a necessary sanitization measure. The land remained abandoned, with local ranchers steering their herds well clear of the area for decades afterward. In the aftermath of the discoveries, authorities attempted to identify all the victims and notify their families. This proved challenging, as many of the remains had deteriorated significantly or were incomplete. Eventually, 6 victims were positively identified through personal effects found in the pit or cellar: Robert Cartwright, Heinrich Müller, Jonathan Farnsworth, William Delaney, Thomas Peterson, and James Ainsworth. The others remained unnamed, though investigators believed the total number of victims likely exceeded 15 based on ledger entries and unidentified remains. The investigation extended to Virginia City, where authorities sought to identify the recipients of Mrs. Blackwood's special preserves. However, with only initials to work from and the transient nature of the mining community, no conclusive identifications were made. Several prominent restaurants and hotels were investigated, but without evidence linking them directly to knowledge of the product's origin, no charges were filed. The case attracted attention from newspapers as far away as San Francisco and Denver, though most reports sanitized the details. The San Francisco Chronicle's July 8, 1881 article titled "Nevada's Boardinghouse of Horror" focused primarily on the robberies and murders, while only obliquely referencing other unspeakable acts committed by the proprietress. This journalistic restraint, common for the era, left the full horror of the Blackwood case known only to investigators and a handful of officials. In 1896, 15 years after the discoveries at Juniper Creek, a woman matching Eleanor Blackwood's description was briefly detained in St. Louis, Missouri, operating a boarding house near the Riverfront District. Before her identity could be confirmed, she disappeared, leaving behind personal belongings but taking whatever money she had accumulated. This incident is documented in St. Louis police records, though the connection to the Nevada case appears to have been made only after she had already fled. The St. Louis establishment, called Mrs. Woodson's Lodging House, had operated for approximately 8 months before suspicions arose. A local butcher reported unusual purchases of preserving chemicals, and a guest had disappeared under questionable circumstances. The proprietress vanished the night before police arrived to question her, leaving behind a room containing newspaper clippings about the Nevada case carefully preserved in a scrapbook. What makes the Blackwood case particularly disturbing is not just the number of victims, but the calculated nature of her operation. The private ledger suggested she had developed a system for selecting victims, typically men traveling alone, carrying significant funds, with no local connections who might immediately report their absence. Her isolated location provided both a steady supply of potential victims and the privacy needed for her activities. The precise motivation behind Eleanor Blackwood's actions remains subject to speculation. The financial gain from robbing her victims certainly played a role, as evidenced by the careful accounting in her private ledger. However, the meticulous nature of the other activities suggested something far more pathological. In 1899, a former guest who had stayed at the boarding house in early 1877 came forward with a recollection that added another layer to the mystery. Thomas Barrett, a mining engineer, reported that during his stay, Mrs. Blackwood had spoken at length about her late husband George and his tragic accident at their previous home in Pennsylvania. According to Barrett's account, she described how George had been trapped in a mine collapse in 1872, and how the other miners, stranded for weeks before rescue, had allegedly been forced to consume the flesh of those who had died in the initial collapse to survive. Blackwood had spoken of the incident not with horror or revulsion, but with a curious detachment, almost academic interest. He recalled feeling unsettled by her detailed knowledge of which parts of the human body were most suitable for sustenance, and her assertion that necessity often reveals truths about human nature that polite society prefers to ignore. County records in Pennsylvania confirmed a mine disaster in the anthracite region during that period, with multiple casualties. Barrett's statement, recorded by a Pennsylvania newspaper seeking to connect the Nevada case to local history, included the observation that however, no George Blackwood was listed among the survivors or victims. This raised the possibility that Eleanor had fabricated this background, perhaps to provide a twisted justification for her own actions. Alternatively, if there was a real George Blackwood, his fate at Eleanor's hands might have been the triggering incident for her subsequent behavior. A deeper investigation into Pennsylvania records revealed an Eleanor Winters who had married a mine supervisor named George Baldwin in Scranton in 1868. This George Baldwin had indeed survived a mine collapse in 1872, though official reports indicated all survivors were rescued within 3 days, not the weeks of desperate conditions described in Mrs. Blackwood's account. George Baldwin was recorded as having left his position at the mine in late 1875, with no further record of him or his wife in the county thereafter. The timing aligns closely with the Blackwoods' appearance in Nevada, suggesting a possible connection, though the name discrepancy remains unexplained. The peculiar nature of her crimes, combining murder, theft, and cannibalism in what appeared to be a methodical, businesslike operation, has led some criminologists to classify Eleanor Blackwood as one of America's earliest documented female serial killers, predating more famous cases by decades. Perhaps most disturbing was the commercial aspect of the operation. The ledger entries suggested that Mrs. Blackwood had established a network of customers who knowingly or unknowingly consumed her special preserves. In the context of frontier Nevada, where fresh meat was scarce and preserved proteins commanded premium prices, she had created a market for her products while simultaneously disposing of evidence. This combination of murder for profit with an elaborate processing and distribution system represents a level of premeditation rarely seen in 19th-century criminal cases. The method by which Mrs. Blackwood subdued her victims remained unclear, though the medical examiner's report noted traces of laudanum, a common opiate tincture, in some of the preserved remains. This suggested she may have drugged her victims before moving them to the cellar rooms. Given her reputation for serving hearty meals, the opportunity to administer such substances would have been ample. What remains most unsettling about the Juniper Creek case is how effectively Eleanor Blackwood exploited the vulnerabilities of frontier society. In a region where people frequently disappeared without trace, where travel was hazardous, and where law enforcement was stretched thin across vast territories, her isolated boarding house became a perfect trap for unwary travelers. Her gender likely provided additional protection from suspicion. As noted in Sheriff McPherson's final report on the case, that these atrocities were perpetrated by a woman has contributed to the difficulty in apprehending the suspect. Our citizens, accustomed to associating violent crime with male perpetrators, have been reluctant to accept the evidence before them, often preferring to theorize about male accomplices who must have performed the actual deeds. The site of Juniper Creek Boarding House remains unmarked on modern maps. The old trail that once passed by the property was abandoned when newer roads were constructed further north. Occasionally, hikers or amateur historians attempt to locate the exact spot using Hayes's survey notes as a guide. Those who claim to have found it report an unusual barrenness to the location. Native sagebrush and juniper grow sparsely there, creating a noticeable void in the otherwise uniform desert landscape. Local ranchers have long maintained their own oral tradition about the site. According to accounts collected by folklore researchers in the 1950s, cattle and horses refused to graze in the vicinity of the former boarding house, becoming agitated when approached to the area. One elderly rancher whose family had worked the neighboring land since the 1890s claimed that even coyotes won't den there, and they'll den just about anywhere else in the county. In 1932, a geology student from the University of Nevada conducted soil samples in the area as part of a regional survey. His field notes, preserved in the university archives, record that the soil in the immediate vicinity of the former Boardinghouse site contained unusually high concentrations of calcium and phosphorus, consistent with bone matter having decomposed in the soil over decades. Whether this represented additional undiscovered remains or simply contamination from the known burial pit remains undetermined. In 1963, during construction of a ranching access road approximately 3 miles from the presumed location of the boarding house, workers uncovered a small metal box containing several gold watches, coins dating from the 1870s, and a folded paper with a list of names. The items were transferred to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, but have never been definitively linked to the Blackwood case. The curator's notes indicate the collection was placed in storage pending further research, but budget constraints and higher priority acquisitions meant this research was never completed. A subsequent examination of the museum's acquisition records in 1987 by true crime researcher Daniel Morrissey revealed that the box also contained a woman's gold wedding band, inscribed with the initials EW to GB, 1860 from, potentially supporting the connection to Eleanor Winters and George Baldwin of Pennsylvania. However, the ring itself could not be located in the museum's collections, having apparently been misplaced during a renovation in the 1970s. The final verified document relating to Eleanor Blackwood is a brief mention in a Denver Post article from October 1901, reporting on an elderly woman who had died in a boarding house fire. Among her possessions was a Nevada land deed bearing the name Blackwood. However, by the time authorities connected this to the infamous case, the woman's body had already been buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. No exhumation was ordered, and the true fate of Nevada's boarding house widow remains officially unresolved. The Denver coroner's report described the deceased as female, approximately 65-70 years of age, slender build, with dark hair heavily streaked with gray. The cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, though the report noted that the fire had apparently originated in the woman's room under suspicious circumstances. Several other tenants reported that the woman had lived there for less than 2 months, kept to herself, and prepared her own meals rather than dining with other boarders. What happened to the men who vanished at Juniper Creek between 1876 and 1881 stands as one of the West's most disturbing chapters, a reminder that in the vast empty spaces of the frontier, a welcoming light in a window could sometimes lead not to shelter, but to an unimaginable fate. The isolation that made Nevada's expanses so challenging to cross also created perfect conditions for predators who understood how to exploit the vulnerable. The case has occasionally resurfaced in popular culture, though often in heavily fictionalized forms. A 1952 pulp novel titled Widow of Death Valley loosely based its murderous female innkeeper on the Blackwood case, though it transplanted the setting and added supernatural elements entirely absent from the historical record. A 1968 low-budget Western film, The Devil's Boarding House, similarly drew inspiration from the case while altering key details and adding a heroic sheriff character who brings the killer to justice, a Hollywood ending far removed from the actual unresolved case. More scholarly attention came in Dr. Margaret Reynolds' 1983 study, Invisible Predators, Female Serial Killers in 19th Century America, which devoted an entire chapter to the Blackwood case. Reynolds argued that Eleanor Blackwood represented a unique criminal typology. Unlike many female killers who target family members or dependents, Blackwood selected adult male strangers in a predatory fashion more commonly associated with male serial murderers. This, combined with the profit motive and methodical processing of victims, places her in a category with few historical parallels. To this day, descendants of some of the identified victims make occasional pilgrimages to the general area where their ancestors met their end. They report an unnatural silence that seems to envelope the location, a place where even the wind moving through the sagebrush seems reluctant to disturb whatever memories might still linger in that lonely depression between Virginia City and Austin. In 1991, Catherine Farnsworth Miller, great-granddaughter of victim Jonathan Farnsworth, placed a small memorial marker near the site. In an interview with a Reno newspaper, she explained, "My family never had a body to bury, never had a proper funeral. For generations, we've lived with this unresolved ending. Placing this marker was the closest thing to closure we could manage after all this time." The marker disappeared within a year, either removed by vandals or covered by the shifting desert soil. The Blackwood case exists in that liminal space between documented history and frontier legend. The basic facts, the disappearances, the discoveries at the Boardinghouse, Eleanor Blackwood's escape from justice, are well established in official records. Yet around these facts has grown a penumbra of local superstition, embellished retellings, and psychological speculation that blurs the boundaries between history and folklore. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood case is its legacy in regional folklore. For decades after the discoveries, travelers in central Nevada would refuse accommodations in isolated locations, particularly those run by women living alone. Stage drivers and later motorists would plan routes specifically to avoid stopping near Juniper Creek, even when the boarding house was long gone. The phrase, "taking Blackwood's rest," entered the local vernacular as a euphemism for someone who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Well into the 20th century, parents in central Nevada mining towns would warn unruly children to behave, or Mrs. Blackwood will get you, transforming the very real historical figure into a bogeyman of regional folklore. The persistence of her name in local oral tradition speaks to the profound impact the case had on the collective psyche of the area. In 1950, Nevada State Highway 722 was constructed, passing approximately 1 mile north of the former Boardinghouse site. During its first decade of operation, highway patrol officers documented an unusual number of single-vehicle accidents along the stretch nearest to Juniper Creek, often occurring at night with drivers reporting sudden feelings of unease or claiming to have seen a woman in dark clothing standing alongside the road. These incidents eventually decreased, though occasional reports continued into the 1970s. As noted, Nevada historian Arthur Bernard wrote in his 1962 compilation of frontier crimes, "What distinguishes the Juniper Creek incidents from mere frontier violence was the calculated patience demonstrated by the perpetrator. Blackwood didn't kill in passion or panic, but created an entire business model around her crimes, operating for years in plain sight." The ledger entries suggest she viewed her victims not as people, but as resources to be cataloged, processed, and utilized. Bernard's analysis touches on what makes the case so disturbing, even by modern standards: the cold industrialization of murder. While the 19th century American West saw no shortage of violence, the methodical nature of the Juniper Creek operation stands apart. Mrs. Blackwood didn't merely kill. She transformed murder into a production process with supply chain, inventory management, and distribution network. The Boardinghouse widow's methods revealed not just criminality, but a disturbing void where human empathy should exist. In the harsh environment of Nevada's high desert, Eleanor Blackwood created her own ecosystem of predation, turning the isolated waypoint into a processing station for human lives that intersected with her path. And somewhere, perhaps, an elderly woman with calculating eyes and a refined manner lived out her final years far from Nevada, carrying her secrets to an unmarked grave, leaving behind only fragments of evidence of one of the American frontier's most disturbing chapters. The true extent of her crimes, like the exact location of her final resting place, remains lost to history. What we know with certainty is limited to dusty records, faded newspaper accounts, and the documented physical evidence recovered from that lonely depression in the Nevada desert. What we will never know the final moments of those travelers who sought only a comfortable bed for the night but found themselves marked with notations about usability in a hidden ledger, is perhaps better left to silence. The next time you travel through Nevada's Central Basin and Range country, look out across those vast empty spaces between towns and consider how recently this land was truly wild, and how that wildness sometimes concealed horrors behind the most civilized facades. For in the case of the Boardinghouse widow, the frontier's greatest monster wore not the face of a hardened outlaw, but the respectable countenance of a woman who offered weary travelers more than just rooms for the night. The records of the Juniper Creek case were officially closed in 1910, when the last potential sighting of Eleanor Blackwood was finally dismissed as unreliable. The case files were archived in the Nevada State Library in Carson City, where they remained largely forgotten until historian Margaret Fleming discovered them while researching frontier women's history in 1958. Even then, the full details were considered too gruesome for her academic publication, receiving only a brief mention as an unusual case of female criminal enterprise in the post-mining era. Fleming's private notes, donated to the University of Nevada archives after her death in 1992, reveal her struggle with how to present the case. "The Blackwood material presents a scholarly dilemma," she wrote. "Its historical significance is undeniable, yet the nature of the crimes is so disturbing that detailed publication risks sensationalism. More troublingly, the methodical, businesslike approach documented in the ledger suggests a type of female criminal largely absent from our understanding of frontier justice. This challenges established gender narratives in ways that may be academically important but publicly unpalatable." In the decades since Fleming's research, the Blackwood case has occasionally been referenced by criminologists studying female serial killers or by historians examining the darker aspects of frontier life. Yet it remains relatively obscure compared to later cases, perhaps because its details strain credibility or because its central figure, unlike many infamous killers, was never apprehended, tried, or interviewed. Without Eleanor Blackwood's own testimony or psychological evaluation, her motivations remain forever speculative. A final piece of the puzzle emerged in 1998 when renovations to an old commercial building in Virginia City uncovered a hidden storage space containing several dozen ceramic crocks and glass jars. Analysis of the residue inside these containers revealed traces of preserved human tissue dating to the late 1870s. The location had housed a specialty food shop during that period, operated by a woman named Margaret Wilson, the same name mentioned as a possible accomplice in the Blackwood case. While this discovery strengthened the theory that Mrs. Blackwood had indeed distributed her special preserves commercially, no documentation directly linking the shop to Juniper Creek was ever found. Perhaps some stories from our past are best left in their dusty folders, remembered only as vague warnings about the darkness that can hide behind a welcoming light in the wilderness. Yet, as long as travelers crossed Nevada's expanses under star-filled skies, the legacy of the Boardinghouse widow and her victims remains an indelible part of the landscape, a reminder that not all predators announce themselves with growls and claws, and that sometimes the most dangerous hospitality is the kind offered with a refined smile and calculating eyes. In the spring of 1968, during a period of unusual rainfall, erosion in the ravine behind the former Boardinghouse site exposed additional remains that had not been discovered during the original investigation. These were collected by the Story County Sheriff's Department and examined at the State Medical Examiner's Office in Reno. Carbon dating confirmed they dated from the same period as the Blackwood killings, though the advanced state of decomposition prevented individual identification. The remains were quietly buried in an unmarked section of the Virginia City Cemetery, the brief report filed away with the original case documents. And so the Juniper Creek Boardinghouse case fades further into history with each passing year. The physical evidence deteriorates, witnesses and their descendants pass away, and the harsh Nevada elements gradually reclaim the site where Eleanor Blackwood once greeted weary travelers with her calculating smile and offers of hearty meals. Yet something of the case persists in the collective memory of the region, a cautionary tale about the dangers that once lurked in isolated places, about the masks people wear, and about how civilization in the American West was sometimes a fragile veneer over primal instincts. The Boardinghouse widow stands as a dark counterpoint to the romanticized version of frontier history, a reminder that not all dangers came from nature or notorious outlaws. In 2002, archaeologist Dr. Rebecca Martinez led a small team conducting a survey of historical sites along the old Central Nevada Road. With proper permits and using ground-penetrating radar, they examined the area around the former Boardinghouse location. Their findings, published in the Journal of Western Archaeological Studies, confirmed the presence of multiple anomalies consistent with disturbed soil and decomposed organic material extending well beyond the ravine where the original remains were discovered. Our data suggests the known burial site represents only a portion of the disposal area, Martinez wrote. Conservative estimates based on soil analysis and subsurface imaging indicate that the total number of victims may be significantly higher than the historical record indicates, possibly exceeding 20 individuals. This assessment aligns with entries in Eleanor Blackwood's ledger, referring to guests who were never officially reported missing. The most intriguing discovery from the archaeological survey was evidence of an underground chamber approximately 50 yards north of the main house foundation, a location not documented in the original investigation. Limited excavation revealed a small room dug into the hard desert soil and reinforced with timber. Inside were found fragments of women's clothing, personal items including a silver locket containing a daguerreotype of a young man, and a partial journal written in a feminine hand, different from Eleanor Blackwood's known writing. The journal fragments, though water-damaged and largely illegible, contained references to Eleanor's methods and keeping the business going. One passage, dated March 1879, reads, "Another month of success. E says the special orders from VC are increasing. I still cannot bring myself to participate in the final preparation, though E insists I must learn every aspect. She says a woman alone must be practical about survival. That sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. This provides the strongest evidence yet for the existence of an accomplice, possibly the mysterious M referenced in Blackwood's ledger." The archaeological team also recovered fragments of specialized equipment from the site, butcher's tools modified for specific purposes, custom glass containers with unusual sealing mechanisms designed for preservation, and evidence of a sophisticated underground ventilation system connecting the various chambers. These findings suggest a level of premeditation and engineering skill not fully appreciated in earlier investigations. During the excavation, Martinez and her team experienced a series of unexplained equipment malfunctions, power failures, and minor accidents. Several team members reported difficulty sleeping while camped near the site, describing vivid nightmares and a persistent sense of being watched. While Martinez's published paper maintains strict scientific objectivity, her private field notes, shared with colleagues years later, acknowledge the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to permeate the location. "There are places where the land itself seems to hold memory," she wrote in an unpublished reflection. "At Juniper Creek the feeling is palpable, a heaviness that descends at dusk, a silence that feels intentional rather than natural. The rational scientist in me rejects such notions, yet I cannot deny the collective experience of my team. Whatever happened here has left an impression that transcends physical evidence." The Martinez expedition represents the last formal study of the site. In 2006, the Bureau of Land Management designated the area restricted citing environmental concerns and the need to protect historical resources. The real motivation, according to former BLM ranger Thomas Grayson, was to prevent amateur sleuths and dark tourism enthusiasts from disturbing what is effectively a mass gravesite. Every few years, someone would come out with metal detectors or shovels looking for relics or macabre souvenirs, Grayson explained in a 2015 interview. We'd find freshly dug holes, evidence of campfires. There was even a group planning to host a midnight seance at the site. The restriction was as much about maintaining the dignity of a burial ground as protecting historical evidence. The legacy of the Boardinghouse widow extends beyond physical evidence and historical records. Her crimes represented a profound violation of 19th century social norms, not just the prohibitions against murder and cannibalism that span all civilized societies, but the specific betrayal of sacred frontier obligations. In the sparsely populated West, offering hospitality to travelers was both a moral duty and a practical necessity for community survival. That a woman would exploit this trust, turning a place of refuge into a slaughterhouse, struck at the heart of frontier society's self-conception. Contemporary newspaper accounts, while avoiding the most gruesome details, repeatedly emphasized the unnatural and unwomanly nature of the crimes. The Virginia City Territorial Enterprise's editorial from July 1881 stated that such depravity could exist within the female breast challenge's comprehension. Even the most hardened criminal maintains some code of honor. Even the basest murderer recognizes some bounds of human conduct. That a woman, nature's nurturer, could systematically slaughter fellow humans for profit represents a perversion so complete as to defy explanation. This gendered framing of the case reflected Victorian assumptions about feminine nature that made Eleanor Blackwood's crimes particularly disturbing to her contemporaries. Female criminals were expected to kill out of passion, desperation, or madness, not calculated avarice. The business-like precision of the Juniper Creek operation, with its ledgers, specialized equipment, and distribution network, seemed more consistent with male patterns of criminality. This incongruity helped Eleanor Blackwood evade suspicion for years and may have contributed to the case's relative obscurity in criminal history. Criminologist Dr. Lawrence Whiting, in his 2010 analysis, Gender and Serial Murder Reassessing Historical Cases, argues that Eleanor Blackwood represents an important counterexample to traditional theories about female killers. The Blackwood case forces us to reconsider gender-based assumptions about motivation, method, and victim selection. Her crimes display characteristics typically associated with male serial killers: stranger victims, profit motive, geographic mobility, and methodical execution, yet predate our formal understanding of such patterns by nearly a century. Whiting further suggests that the cannibalistic aspect of the Blackwood case, while exceptional, reflects a certain frontier pragmatism. In an environment where resources were scarce and waste was luxury, Blackwood's decision to process her victims served multiple purposes: evidence disposal, additional profit, and perhaps psychological satisfaction. This represents a disturbing convergence of frontier necessity and pathological impulse. The psychological profile of Eleanor Blackwood has fascinated modern forensic psychiatrists, though they caution that posthumous diagnosis across historical distance is inherently speculative. Dr. Elaine Chambers, writing in the Journal of Historical Criminology, suggests the available evidence, methodical record-keeping, lack of impulsivity, apparent absence of remorse, exploitation of social norms for predatory purposes is consistent with what we would now identify as psychopathic traits. The additional element of commercializing cannibalism indicates a profound detachment from normal human empathy and social conditioning. Others have proposed alternative theories. Historian Richard Dawson, in his book Frontier Justice and Frontier Crimes, suggests the possibility that Eleanor Blackwood may have been the victim of her husband George before becoming a perpetrator herself. If we accept the Pennsylvania connection and the mine disaster story as partially true, it's possible that Eleanor witnessed or was forced to participate in cannibalism during a survival situation. This traumatic experience, perhaps compounded by abuse from her husband, may have fundamentally altered her relationship with social taboos. Dawson cites the suspicious disappearance of George Blackwood and the transfer of the property to Eleanor as potential evidence that her first victim may have been her husband, a theory supported by the fact that no remains identified as George Blackwood were ever found, despite thorough excavation of the property. The ledger begins in 1877, but her husband disappeared in 1876, Dawson notes. What happened in that intervening year? Did she discover a taste for both profit and power through that initial act? Whatever her psychology, Eleanor Blackwood's methods revealed a chilling intelligence. She selected her location strategically, isolated enough for privacy, yet positioned along a traveled route to ensure a steady supply of potential victims. She cultivated a respectable persona that deflected suspicion, leveraging gender expectations of the era. Her record-keeping demonstrates awareness of each victim's value, both in terms of immediate robbery and longer-term processing. Most disturbing is her apparent creation of a market for her products, suggesting she had identified customers either willing to ignore the unusual nature of her special preserves or possibly even aware of their source. The case raises uncomfortable questions about community complicity. Given the detailed sales records in her ledger, it seems likely that at least some residents of Virginia City regularly purchased and consumed Blackwood's products. Whether they knew or suspected their true nature remains unproven, though the premium prices they paid suggest the special preserves were understood to be unusual in some respect. After the case became public, no customers ever came forward or were identified, suggesting either ignorance or a collective desire to avoid association with the scandal. By 1967, when the last known person with direct memory of the case, a 103-year-old former stagecoach driver named Ezekiel Taylor, passed away in a Carson City nursing home, the Boardinghouse widow had already begun the transition from historical criminal to regional legend. Taylor's recorded oral history, preserved in the Nevada State Archives, offers one of the few first-hand accounts of Eleanor Blackwood. Proper-looking woman, always in black, like she was mourning. Had a way of looking at you, not unfriendly mind, but assessing like. I stopped there for water and coffee maybe a dozen times. Always declined to stay the night, though she offered. Something in my gut said not to. Guess my gut saved my hide. In modern Nevada, the Blackwood case has become part of the state's darker folklore. Ghost tours in Virginia City sometimes mention her, though the actual location of Juniper Creek Boardinghouse remains off typical tourist routes. Occasional articles appear in regional magazines around Halloween, usually focusing on the more sensational aspects while omitting the methodical business operation documented in the ledger. A Nevada-based craft brewery briefly marketed a Boardinghouse bitter before public complaints about the insensitivity of commercializing a mass murder site prompted a name change. The most lasting impact of the case may be in the academic reassessment of frontier criminal history. For decades, standard histories of the American West focused on male outlaws, train robbers, cattle rustlers, gunslingers, while largely overlooking female criminals except in contexts of prostitution or crimes of passion. The Blackwood case, with its methodical predation and businesslike approach to murder, challenges this gendered narrative of frontier criminality. Contemporary scholars like Dr. Catherine Rhodes, who specializes in women's history of the American West, argue that cases like Eleanor Blackwood's reveal important truths about frontier society. The isolation and limited law enforcement that characterized the territorial period created opportunities for predatory behavior across gender lines. While male criminals tended toward more visible and aggressive forms of outlawry, Women like Blackwood exploited social assumptions about female nurturing and domesticity to operate with remarkable impunity. Rhodes further suggests that the relative obscurity of the Blackwood case in popular culture reflects ongoing discomfort with female predators. We've mythologized male outlaws into folk heroes, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, while female killers remain disturbing anomalies that challenge our preferred narratives. Eleanor Blackwood doesn't fit the Madonna-whore dichotomy through which frontier women are typically viewed, so her story gets footnoted rather than featured. The site of Juniper Creek today bears little obvious evidence of its dark history. The desert has reclaimed what humans abandoned. Sagebrush and scrubby juniper grow across the depression where once travelers sought refuge. Only the unnatural configuration of certain rocks, remnants of the foundation, and the persistent barrenness of the soil around the ravine suggest human habitation once existed here. Yet something intangible remains. Local ranchers still report that cattle refuse to graze in the immediate vicinity. Hikers describe an unaccountable sense of dread that descends as they approach the coordinates noted in old survey maps. Wildlife patterns show a curious void. Birds rarely perch in the area. Coyotes skirt its boundaries. Whether these phenomena reflect some persistent physical contamination of the site or merely the power of known history to influence perception remains debatable. In 1969, folklorist William Jensen conducted interviews with residents of central Nevada regarding local superstitions. Multiple subjects independently mentioned the belief that speaking Eleanor Blackwood's name after dark would summon her spirit. Others described nightmares featuring a woman in black offering food after they had camped near the old Central Nevada Road. Jensen's academic paper on these beliefs notes the unusual consistency of the reported phenomena compared to typical regional ghost stories. The final fate of Eleanor Blackwood herself remains the case's central mystery. The Denver death in 1901 provides the most plausible conclusion, yet lacks definitive confirmation. Other theories persist that she escaped to South America with her accumulated wealth, that she established a new identity in an eastern city, that she met with foul play at the hands of an accomplice or victim's relative seeking revenge. Without exhumation of the Denver grave, now covered by urban development or discovery of authenticated later records, her ultimate end remains speculative. What is certain is that between 1876 and 1881, at an isolated waypoint in the Nevada desert, a refined widow with calculating eyes welcomed weary travelers, served them hearty meals, and selected which ones would leave with their lives and which would become entries in her meticulous ledger. Some became notations of robbery, others became ingredients for her special preserves, but all were processed through her methodical system that transformed human lives into profit. In the history of American crime, few cases combine such calculated predation with such effective exploitation of social norms. Eleanor Blackwood understood that a woman running a boarding house raised no suspicions, that a widow dressed in black evoked sympathy rather than fear, that isolated men carrying valuables made perfect victims in a land where disappearances were common. She weaponized 19th-century gender expectations, turning the very invisibility imposed on frontier women into a shield for her activities. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the boarding house widow is how close she came to escaping detection entirely. Had the surveying party not happened to notice the gleam of a gold watch in that ravine, had Eleanor Blackwood been slightly more thorough in disposing of evidence, her crimes might have remained undiscovered. How many other predators operated in those vast spaces, their victims attributed to accident, exposure, or Indian attack? How many other roadside establishments concealed similar horrors behind welcoming facades? The next time you drive the long stretches of Highway 50 across central Nevada, what modern tourists call the loneliest road in America, consider that its predecessor routes were lonelier still. Consider the courage it took for travelers to entrust their safety to strangers in remote outposts. And perhaps, as you pass the unmarked turnoff that would lead to Juniper Creek, Listen for the echo of what old Nevada hands still call Blackwood's silence, that peculiar stillness that settles over certain places where history has left its darkest mark. For in that empty landscape, the story of the boarding-house widow reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who offer shelter from the wilderness, and that civilization itself can sometimes be the thinnest of veneers over human capacity for calculated evil.